Hello, my name is Claire McLellan, and I work in the Drinking Water Protection Program at the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality here in Portland. I focus on helping small public water systems take voluntary actions to protect where their drinking water comes from, or what we call source water protection. And I'll talk more about that later. But I also briefly wanted to introduce my colleague Tessa Edelin, who will not be joining the presentation, but who provides this type of assistance to public water systems in Northwest and Eastern Oregon. So a contact email to get in touch with us will be shown on the final slide. And thank you to the Marion Soil and Water Conservation District for inviting us to present at this great workshop. I'm looking forward to discussing drinking water stewardship and specifically how you can help protect our groundwater resources by taking actions on your land. So in this region of Oregon, as I'm sure you're aware, most people get their drinking water from wells that draw from groundwater aquifers. And although we don't always think about it this way, what happens on the land surface can impact groundwater. For example, this diagram shows that things like septic tanks, household hazardous waste, pesticides, livestock waste, and other potential sources of contamination can reach the aquifer by sinking through the soil, and those contaminants can be chemical. For example, nitrates are one type of contaminant that we think about in terms of drinking water, or bacterial, for example, E. coli or other coliform bacteria. And this map shows the surface area around a drinking water well, which contributes groundwater to that well's aquifer that it draws from. So the yellow circles show the zone on the land surface where contaminants that sink into the soil have the potential to reach that well's entry point into the aquifer within 2 years. So we call this the 2-year time of travel zone, is this outer yellow circle. For example, if septic systems exist within this yellow circle, within the drinking water source area, those could potentially be a source of bacterial or other contamination for this well if they're not properly maintained. And the green circles show the 10 and 15-year time of travel. So drinking water source areas are really large for most groundwater wells. And everybody wants clean and safe drinking water, right? So it makes sense to do everything we can to protect where it comes from. Which leads me to a big focus of the Drinking Water Protection Program at DEQ, which is what we call source water protection. And we define that as actions or strategies that mitigate potential sources of contamination in a drinking water source area. Source water protection can reduce water treatment needs and costs. And in fact, a US EPA study has found that preventative source water protection can be 5 to 200 times less expensive than cleaning up a contaminated water supply. And because drinking water wells draw from aquifers that underlie land that is used or owned by many people, source water protection is not just up to the person or people who use a well. It is a community effort. So by adopting best practices on your land, you can protect drinking water not only for yourself, but also for your neighbors. Before I delve into the specifics of groundwater-friendly best practices that you can use on your land, I want to quickly define what we mean when we talk about public versus private water supplies. So in Oregon, a public water system serves more than 10 people or 3 connections, and it's regulated by the Oregon Health Authority under state rules or the EPA's Safe Drinking Water Act. Well maintenance and monitoring are required on a regular basis for public water systems. A private water supply typically serves just one property, and the homeowner is responsible for maintenance and ensuring the water is safe to drink. Well sampling isn't required unless there is a property transfer, but regular testing of the well water is highly recommended. These maps provide an example of a contaminant that impacts both public and private water supplies in Oregon that I briefly talked about, which is nitrates. And nitrates can come from a variety of sources such as manure, septic systems or other wastewater systems, pesticides, fertilizers, manufacturing, etc. And elevated levels of nitrates have been detected in drinking water wells across Oregon, as you can see in the map on the left. This data comes from real estate transaction data in which water quality information is recorded when wells on private properties change hands. Addresses and property information are, of course, kept confidential. And the map on the right shows nitrate levels in private wells in Marion County from that same real estate transaction data set, so it's essentially just zoomed in. 158 of the nitrate results in Marion County are at moderate to high levels of nitrates, which is above 3 milligrams per liter, so any yellow or red diamonds in the map on the right. And these moderate to high results are concentrated north of the Salem-Keizer area and southeast of Staten along the Santiam River area. The map on the right also shows that there are 174 public groundwater supplies providing drinking water, which are marked by brown and yellow circles in Marion County. And while the nitrate results shown here are for private wells and not for public water supplies, we can connect the dots and just begin to see that elevated nitrate levels are an area-wide problem for public and private drinking water supplies. So now that I've talked about some of the problems we might see and why source water protection is a good idea, I want to discuss some actions that you can take on your land to help protect drinking water. First off, septic systems can be sources of bacterial and chemical contaminants, as we've discussed, to groundwater wells if they're not properly maintained. So if you use a septic system, it is important to have it inspected and pumped regularly by a licensed service provider. And depending on the condition and type of the system you have, it's typically a good idea to get it serviced every 1 to 3 years. You can avoid flushing things besides toilet paper. Even items that say they are flushable should not be flushed down the toilet unless it's toilet paper. You should avoid pouring fats and grease, chemicals and solids down sink drains, as these can clog up the septic system and stop it from properly processing waste. And finally, keeping the septic drain fields clear of trees, vehicles, or other heavy uses that could damage septic lines or tanks is another great way to protect your septic system. Household hazardous waste is a second area where taking actions on your land can help protect drinking water. So household hazardous waste means chemicals or materials we use that can be harmful if not properly disposed of. Some common examples include unused paint, car batteries, car fluids like oil or antifreeze, yard fertilizers, pesticides, harsh cleaning chemicals, etc. And if these items contaminate your drinking water well or aquifer, cleanup can be very costly and the water could be unsafe to drink. So it's really good to take preventative action. For example, you can keep your well house clean, just in general, a good idea, of course, but being sure to store any of these chemicals or materials away from the well, ideally in a secondary containment that would catch any potential leaks. If you have any of these chemicals or items sitting around, you can bring them to a collection site for safe disposal. This is a picture of a household hazardous waste collection site in Oregon. And if you're a Marion County resident, this address is where the household hazardous waste collection site is located and their phone number. And you can bring any materials or chemicals that they accept for free disposal, in fact. And other counties have similar collection sites or recurring events for household hazardous waste collection. So be sure to look into that. And finally, just trying to use less toxic alternatives altogether will reduce the presence of household hazardous waste and protect drinking water. Unused wells can also be a source of contamination for groundwater. So as you can see in this diagram, an unused well that is not properly capped or shut down can essentially act as a straw into the aquifer, through which contaminants can travel either through the surface or through the soil and reach the aquifer and potentially contaminate any active wells. So to protect your drinking water wells, be sure to first identify any unused wells on your property, then get assistance from a licensed well driller and the Oregon Water Resources Department to properly shut down and cap the unused well. This mitigates the risk of it acting as a conduit for contaminants. It is likely that funding will be available later this year to help people shut down unused and abandoned wells, since this has really been identified as a public health priority. So stay tuned for more information on that later this year. If you think you might have an unused well on your property, be sure to just be aware of that. And finally, addressing crops and animals will help protect your drinking water. We know that having a clean water supply is, of course, important to any animals you raise, and it's also important to keep animals away from your water supply to prevent them from contaminating it, for like these sheep hanging out right by the wellhead. Don't love to see that. Livestock and cropland can be sources of nitrates and bacteria that can contaminate groundwater if they're not properly managed. So some best practices that can decrease the risk of this contamination include keeping livestock and manure away from wells, saturated soils, and water bodies, protecting manure piles from rain and surface runoff, and the soil and water conservation districts like Marion SWCD are excellent resources for assistance in managing mud, manure, weeds, and pastures in a drinking water friendly way. So be sure to ask them for assistance. And finally, avoid over-applying pesticides or fertilizers on lawns, gardens, pastures, and fields. So being a groundwater steward makes you a good neighbor. By using these best practices on your land, you can help protect your own and others' drinking water wells. Thank you for watching this presentation, and please feel free to get in touch with the Drinking Water Protection Team at the DEQ with this email, or contact the Oregon Health Authority Drinking Water Services here, and find some other resources for private well owners from Oregon State University, Oregon Water Resources Department, and the Oregon Health Authority's Domestic Well Safety Program. Thank you again, and I look forward to hopefully meeting you during our Q&A session later on.